as we continue our dinner, we'll start our discussion so that we can overlap with a couple of those bites and thoughts. Um, but we started last week kind of looking at the introduction, chapter 1. We started a little bit to touch on chapter 2. So I kind of want to do the rest of chapter 2, kind of the hope for beloved community, start there, but then end with chapter 3, and we'll pick up our conversation with that. How does that? So in the end of chapter 2, the author talks about kind of this hope for beloved community and how that transcends race and religious tradition and time, that many people from many generations and many traditions are all advocates of this thing called beloved community. And that's the thing that we find ourselves also advocating for, hence the need for these really hard conversations. And for this need for, like this author is doing, to confront some truths that may be hard to confront, but are nonetheless required if we want to build the love community with the very people that are the subject of these chapters. And so the origins of the nightmare, chapter 3, the author kind of goes through a historical analysis of conquest, imperialism, colonialism, and how the church is directly and sometimes indirectly connected to a lot of efforts that can be traced back to the 13th century, all the way to even some efforts that she outlined in the 21st century that marginalize in some way some type of community or some people group. Now, certainly, the earlier examples that she gave were, kind of more, I would say, institutional. It was, papal creeds that were kind of sent out and actions that impacted large groups of people and whole nations and whole countries. Whereas I think once colonialism became situated as a specifically Western thing, the bullet points that she named were more specifically about Northern European domination and American domination of mostly the Western Hemisphere. And through all sorts of things. She talked about enslavement, she talked about treaties that were broken with indigenous groups, she talked about genocide, she talked about a number of realities that marginalize groups of people based on a whole host of things, most especially race. She made a distinction between two things, though, that I think is very important. She talked about whiteness as opposed to white people. Like, those are very different things. Like, she talked about whiteness as a culture that any kind of person, regardless of skin color, can find themselves in. And that's different or distinct from white people, specifically those of Euro or European descent. And then the third group, white nationalist or white supremacy, I think also is a very distinct group that's worth naming, because you can be in each of these categories or in one or in none, right? And they're not all synonymous, that they all name very different things. You can be a person of white Euro descent that's not a white nationalist. You could be a white nationalist that's not a person of white Euro descent.
What is a white nationalist, if I may ask?
So a white nationalist is a person who believes that that all of society should be ordered around and reflective of whiteness.
Okay, I get the picture. I'm not so keen about that. I have white blood, as you can see, and I'm fully Caucasian, Northern European. I don't like the idea at all. So
And I think the author tries to talk about the distinction between those very disparate categories, because there are people who don't like those categories, and there are people who do. So how can we talk about each of these groups of people without generalizing? Just like all Black people aren't thugs and criminals, all white people aren't white nationalists and racists. So we have to be able to, and no, are these categories conclusive? I don't believe so. I just believe this author uses these categories to have these conversations, but that we should be mindful that there are other categories, I'm sure, that people could use, but these categories help us to organize the conversation. So I have one first question to open up the floor. Did you learn anything new, or did anything surprise you?
I thought it was very interesting when she reversed the terms white supremacists and supreme white.
Can you say more? What came up for you with that?
Well, just the attitude. The whole culture. You know, I mean, I remember last week I was struggling, trying to understand the concept of the beloved community. You know, I have a better idea of where that's going at this point. And you put it in the context of what's going on politically today. You know, I've always been interested in what happened after the Civil War, you know, during Reconstruction, and the way that some of the, the concepts that they were trying to introduce, you know, we wouldn't have the problems that we have today if those had been put in place during Reconstruction, but it was all blocked. You know, and that's same attitude is with us today. That's all I'll say.
Thank you.
Because it gets more tangled and more intense, the more you talk.
Well, that was during the antebellum stuff, right? Correct?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
What others?
Can you repeat the question?
Did you learn anything new, or did anything surprise you when you're reading? And even if you're not yet at chapter 3, I think that can still apply.
I think what surprised me most is lots of what she was talking about is what I feel, but I don't see that out in the world. You know, there's somebody else that gets it, and that made me feel hopeful, because, you know, last few years, just the way the world is, it's hard to feel hopeful.
I had not obviously read a whole lot of our writings from our founding fathers. I knew there was shady things there, but I had not really read them directly, so to read it in black and white, no pun intended, was a little disturbing.
I think a little less of Ben Franklin at this point.
I sadly do. I'm thinking, did you just shock some brainwaves while you were flying like that? Anyways. But you know, reading her history of it, it's like so ingrained and it goes so far back. And you know, I mean, I know generational and ancestral trauma, you know, it just makes you think about the genetics of people being seen as less than for so many, you know, and then that perpetuates. But the other thing that really struck me was the idea of being self-centrism,
Yes.
which I thought was a really fascinating, I'd never heard that term before, versus self-centered. And I thought that defines a lot of stuff in our country right now. You know, everything revolves around us and we are, and that to me is also that nationalism thing of we're the best. And my mom used to complain about how many flags there were everywhere. We went to Disney World visiting her sisters who lived in Florida. She's like, oh my gosh, another flag. Not that she wasn't a proud American and happy to be in this country, but the order is, you know, country God for some people as opposed to
That's
God,
mine.
you know, kind of thing. So,
Well, that's because God favors this.
of course, you know, we are, and the lovely white, what the hell was that? Sorry, excuse me, but that was just. That's, anyways, that surprised me, and I learned something.
I've seen so many of those groups on talk shows and on TVs, and they just make me sick, these white nationalist groups. They think their way is the God-given way. The way they look is awful too, things they do.
It made me understand, not agree with, but understand a little better why so many groups are complaining about actually teaching history the way history was.
Yes. Yes.
I understand why they can be quite upset. I mean, this is hard to read.
And then that's, we can jump ahead, I had 3 questions for tonight, but that leads to my 3rd question, which now will become my 2nd question. Because you're right, this is why books are banned, this is why certain authors are said that, you know, they cannot come into certain territories or jurisdictions to speak or to have their books, you know, in libraries and stores, those areas, because the truths that they unearth could cause a reaction that can't be contained. And everybody's biggest fear, especially politicians or those in leadership, is losing power. Whether it's losing control over your, you know, community or losing control over your constituency. If they all of a sudden, and I'm setting this up so that I put JM on the spot to talk about this, because in the Black church especially, there is this propensity to withdraw ourselves from certain facts. So it's not to color over. Like I've been in some predominantly white spaces where the tendency is to kind of water down things. Oh, it really wasn't that bad, or we don't have all the facts. But I've been in some predominantly Black spaces where it's like, no, we will just not go there because we can't. Like if we go there, we just can't. Like to have that conversation will unravel our faith, will send us into an abyss. And if we ask any questions that lead to an awakening, that is simultaneous, or not simultaneous, that is synonymous with, almost synonymous with like evil or Satan's work. Because the moment that, you know, for some of us, we're told the moment you go to seminary,
Or cemetery.
you go to the cemetery.
Uh,
And so it's on both sides. If we find out certainly that our white heroes did and said some really horrible things, on the contrary, if we find out that there are some Black folks who participate in their own oppression, we have some problems. And so the question I have, and this is why I'm putting JM on the spot, how do we get to a place where we can talk about and hear hard things that we or our communities are guilty of?
This is, let me know if I'm talking too much.
Gives me more time to eat chili.
Let me know if I'm talking. Years ago, I had a student that I cared for about a great deal. Young Black person, young man, and he absolutely fell in love with the bass and badly wanted to be a music major. And, you know, and at that point, this was before I was teaching at Wayne State. and everything. Now, there was some political stuff going on at the same time, I won't get into that. Ultimately, he was not able to do that, his parents would not let him. They did not want him to have anything to do with classical music because too much of it had been written, it was written by dead white Europeans.
Yeah.
So that,
Yeah,
that's the other side of,
yeah.
you know.
I was thinking the other day, classical music to white people is what gospel music is to Black people. There is a root that's divine. And when you become awakened enough, you can see the divinity in other forms of music, of course. But when you grow up with that as your base, anything that threatens that can almost seem not divine or evil. And so for very limited, narrow-minded, small-minded people, especially those that I grew up around, anything that threatened Blackness or the little bit of pride that we could find, especially whiteness, because it resembled the oppressor in those situations, was not okay. And if I hadn't, and my siblings, if we hadn't become people that traveled extensively and been to other countries and seen that oppression can have many colors, there are Black people in predominantly Black countries that oppress each other, so then it's not racism, it's classism, or it's power, or it's gender, or it's all these other things, but we can't always say everything is racism. Every problem that you have in your life isn't always racism, and yet we can name those times when it is.
Well, jazz, jazz and many music departments.
Yeah.
Still, many music departments, don't allow jazz to be taught because it's lesser music or something like that.
Because it's what?
Lesser music,
Okay.
it's not, which is, fortunately, all the places I've taught have very strong jazz programs, but.
So let me ask you a question. So going to seminaries, going to cemetery, why was that? Because it was predominantly white seminaries, or?
No, it's because it's not esoterically focused. It's not about the spirit, it's about rational intellect. And so for a lot of Black people, the rational intellect is what caused them to be oppressed. The great chain of being, they say that man is the ideal right under God. And so then the white man is the one that has more intelligence than the Black man. And so that creates these barriers of having hard conversations because we then identify race as the cause instead of understanding that ignorance is actually the cause. And we don't want to talk about ignorance because we have loyalty to the things that we believe is right. Because we want to be more right than righteous. Because righteous means that you can do and learn something that by law it could even be wrong, but it's right because it protects those who need to be protected the most. That's why activism is a thing, because it is illegal in some places to do activism, but it cares for the least of these. To speak to the point around the cognitive dissonance, theologians tend to call it, Paul Knitter, which is a theologian that is both a Buddhist and a Christian. He calls it sacred canopies, but we know them as sacred cows, which are things that if anything bump up against it, the mind literally stops. You can't talk about that. And one of the biggest things in the African American church is the Bible. And we understand that the sola scriptura, the Bible is the infallible word, is a thing that's not just in the Black churches, right? However, for instance, my grandmother came from the Deep South and she learned how to read with the Bible. So now the Bible not only carries a spiritual connotation, it also carries a personal and social connotation because that's the only book that many people could own. And then it became an heirloom or something that was important that was passed on. But if we're not willing to have hard conversations around the fact that Bibles were created to subjugate Black people, and they call them slave Bibles because they removed positions and things in the Bible and then preached the parts of the Bible that says slaves obey your master, you should be seen and not heard, et cetera, et cetera. And so to push back against that ideology, they made Black folks, especially in the antebellum and in the Reconstruction, they made the Bible theirs. So they redeemed it back. And so that's why now, if you push against something that's now this sacred cow, something that's now this sacred canopy, something that if you push past that, you are now even perhaps coming against their theology, there's a shutdown there because we can't agree, because that seems to be more important to me than to you. But this is my lifeline, is what they're thinking. And you're saying to me, I can't have my lifeline.
It's because their identity has been wrapped up in their faith. There isn't a distinction between the two. And even more than that, if their faith has been inherited from family members, to challenge your faith then is to challenge your family. And if your family is the thing that has gotten you through, because if you're enslaved or very working class or underrepresented, oftentimes the family group or the community is all that you have. And so to say they're all wrong, or perhaps they all might not have all the information. I mean, we have been thrown out of churches for lesser reasons, right? But
Yeah.
that's like a grave sin to say that your great grandmother was wrong. But what if she was?
So when we were in Israel, I told you last week that we took a trip to Israel with this group. One of the tour guides, I can't remember his country of origin, maybe he's Catholic, obviously, maybe there was. He would point out a place and he would say, this is the spot where such and such happened. And how do I know this? Because my father told me. And how did he know it? Because his father told him. And he would say it like 3 or 4 times every time we went someplace. My husband's still talking about it. He goes, remember when, so-and-so, I know it because and it's like, yeah, well, what if one of them misheard?
That's right.
What if it was over here and out here? It's like, and I guess I feel like that's the grace of God, is that we all need to learn and grow. And
Well, that's why we can have these conversations, and that leads back to the other question. How can we have conversations that are hard? How can we read books like this where we may agree or disagree and still have a conversation about it, not be ripping your hair out, not be standing on a corner saying these people are evil and go back to wherever, or to even be able to sit down and have a conversation like this without feeling hopeless or overwhelmed or diminished or somehow like giving up, because Larry and I were talking just a little bit before this, like some of this is really hard. It's really hard to read some of this, and yet I feel like as Christians we must.
Well, and that's one of the things that with not teaching all of American history. At the gym I go to, 95% of the clientele are African American. And this one woman, a couple times wore a t-shirt, it said Black History 24/7, 365 or something like that. And the first time I saw her wear it was last month. And I think that became more, for 1 month out of the year, our kids listen to Martin Luther King Jr.'s talk.
Yeah.
It's all wonderful, and we're wonderful now because we liked what he said. So that gives us all off the hook. Now our ancestors were perfect. And I look at my African American friends, and especially children, it's like, how can you grow up now? I mean, what if that continues? Like what Florida is doing. And I look at my grandbabies now and I think, how are we gonna teach you, your next door neighbor and the people across the street, and what happened? it's just really amazing to me that it's gotten to the point where we don't want to even admit there was. So they came over to work.
And if it's hard.
I mean, it's just, I don't understand how,
It makes me think of how the Jews must feel about people denying the Holocaust
Yes.
in a way. you know,
I
just
can't
erase the whole
understand
thing.
how people in Florida feel. I was just visiting my cousin, she lives in a suburb of Fort Lauderdale. So we were in Fort Lauderdale, Boca Raton, Miami, extremely diverse. How do these people deal with this every day, knowing that their governor and a group of individuals want them gone? They don't exist.
well, and the,
Or if they exist, and how did they put it in the book, they have to exist through the bodies of a white person.
Contributing to that culture. As long as
Yes,
you uphold our consumerism or whatever it is we need, then.
well, it's a power thing. Unfortunately, for you guys, you know, we're gonna be in the minority fairly soon. White European people in this country are gonna be the minority.
and what's the minority
And-
now has the right, which I hope they don't do, to reverse. And you know,
And I
and
think
be
that's,
cruel to white kids.
and I think that's why people are so afraid and are becoming so extreme with the white nationalist thing, you know, is that we don't wanna give up our power. We're the ones in charge, we're, you know. And, I mean, it's not gonna stop.
This is where I say, if we don't know the history, we're bound to repeat it. The thing that's interesting is that during the 60s, when Black people were saying we want civil rights, and subsequently the Black nationalists and the Black arts movement that came after that in the 70s and 80s, and then we had the war on drugs, and then we had mass incarceration, and all of a sudden we find ourselves 30 years from that place, saying white people have stopped reproducing at the same rate as Black people. Well, guess who has also stopped reproducing at the same rate? Black people. We're both gonna be outnumbered, and it's gonna be Spanish-speaking people that outnumber all of us. And the difficulty is they don't have the same history of African-American enslavement, however, they do have a history of oppression. And so what, I fear is that Black people and white people alike will get so caught up in our need to reconcile the pain that our ancestors caused each other for whatever reason. Either they wanted freedom and left one group to work for themselves, or the other group wanted to continue to oppress and, market off of their free labor. We're missing this other group of people that has been kind of building, right? We have Africans that have come and found work, and yeah, maybe they also found exploitation here, but they're also raising their kids here who see the political processes that we have, and they're matriculating through Congress. And we have Spanish-speaking people and Muslim people who are also matriculating through our systems and learning English just as well as they know all of the other dialects that they know, putting us all at a disadvantage, because if we don't even want our kids to read certain books, we're sure as hell not teaching them multiple languages with fluency. We're telling them, yeah, take a couple languages, but it's not held to the same standard as English. In 40 years, if you don't speak 3 languages, you're gonna be at a disadvantage. If you're white or just Black, you're gonna be at a disadvantage.
Truly a melting pot.
That's right. Everyone's gonna be a shade of
It's
brown,
gonna be a melting pot.
and it's not gonna be all Christian.
you know I find it interesting. I think I was in the 2nd grade, and it's amazing I remember this, but it's stuck with me. What you're discussing is what our 2nd grade teacher talked about. So that would have been like 1850, 1860, 7 years old.
Wow.
About that right now, whites are the minority, it will be the Hispanic, it will be the Spanish speaking, that will be the majority somewhere after the turn of the century. I mean, I remember that, and because he said, in the turn of the century will be in the year 2000, I'll be 48 years old, I'm gonna be so old. I'm older than that now. So, and that, maybe I'm a perceptual person, so that got to me. And here we are, all those years later, having done nothing to prepare our society for these changes. We fought it. I'm using that
Yeah,
as a
yeah.
general term, but we fought it. And the white man is still fighting for control, and can the minority control the majority? That's what this is, all this, you can say it's, black against white, or Republican against Democrat, or whatever. It all boils down to can the minority, which the white is becoming, control the majority?
I would love to speak to that timeline and also to something that was said that was very important to bring up in the room. Since the civil rights movement, and most of the people in this room have been engaged in this work for at least 60 years, I want to bring a consideration that Black people aren't surprised at the things that are happening. Not only are they not surprised, speaking to even younger Black people, it's almost like we'll see it when it happens. So the change is what's going to be surprised, not the continued behavior. Like if we begin to have more meaningful conversation and a more egalitarian process that transcends race, gender, and all these other separations happen, that'll be the surprise. Not that DeSantis is doing what he's doing, not that there's almost been 60 or 70 Black trans women that have died in this year alone, and probably no one has seen it on the news because it's not something that the news will talk about, right? These things are common. It's common for I was reading the book and I didn't even think about it, but they said in Black individuals there's this second voice that they will have to be themselves and then turn themselves off to be someone else when they go into a room. And the conversation was between a Black man and a white man. The white man said, I never had to think about even having to do that. And so I'm only saying that to say this is built within us in our generations. Our mothers and grandmothers and grandfathers taught us how to walk, how to stand, how to move to the other side of the room, how not to have too much eye contact, how to put your hands on the steering wheel when the people come, how to drive slower when you see a police car so you won't get pulled over, how to call somebody when you get pulled over. Like, these are things that has to be in the background, and it has to be in the background for 60 and more years. So when we see now the world saying, oh my God, this stuff is happening, I'm excited personally that we are having these conversations. And I know that even me being in mostly white spaces, there's a hope there. And my hope is a lot further than a lot of people's hope that I am in close conversations with. No one is really, a lot of people aren't really thinking that a difference is going to happen. And so that's why it's important that I believe that we're having a conversation like this, because it is changing the narrative, because you're saying, we had this conversation when I was in second grade. So this is the conversations we've been having. And if this conversation is not working, there is a intentional reason why it is not working. And maybe it would be more important to find another way to provide relief, even outside of having a particular race conversation.
Was that teacher, do you think, had her tongue more open-minded in today's world? Would she even be allowed to discuss that? She talked
Yeah.
about, the Hispanics and Spanish-speaking people would be, and they are, would that, you're in the schools, do you think that even be discussed today?
Probably not, but I was thinking when we were talking about this, being in the schools and just being with elementary kids.
Yeah.
I wish our world could be like that. They truly, I know they see color, but they all, all different nationalities, all mixed, it's not like all the black kids here and all white kids and all the Indian kids. They're all mixed together, and it's just, when I see that, I love that, and I hope things don't change for them,
Yeah,
That's what
the
the
girls
Chip's house
early
is,
here.
United Nations playing in the backyard, you know?
Yes.
Love it.
Well, it's funny because during our orientation, we do orientation on Monday and Tuesday, with people across the country for Trinity Health, and we'll have a couple hundred people on the call. And one of the things we talk about is looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion in the healthcare space, not just from colleagues, but from patient care and making sure they're getting, equal care, and we're watching out for things that we might have dismissed in the past and things like that. And one of the things we talk about is that we know our patients going forward are less likely to speak English as a primary language. They're less likely to be white, less likely to be college educated. There's a whole list of things we talk about, and that we have to take that into account as we're looking at giving equitable care so that people can follow their healthcare requirements to stay well, and things like that. The classic example that's used, you guys have probably all heard about it, the two twin girls. One parent is African American, one is white, and each girl looks like one of the parents. And the more white girl goes into the ER and is having all this pain, and they can't figure out what's wrong, and the Caucasian parent brought her to the ER. And they can't figure out what's wrong, give her some medicine, send her home, whatever, comes back a little while later, same problem, a lot. Well, then I think by the second or the third visit, the African American parent breaks them and says, wait, are you the parent? And she had sickle cell anemia. And they never looked at it because she presented very fair skinned, so they never even thought of it. And yet, genetically, she was absolutely, so, we look at that, I'm very fortunate for the company that I work for, because our CEO will say outright, and he declared, racial injustice as a social health problem that we all need to address. And so he's very active and very forthright about, we need to look at this. We need to look at where we made mistakes. We need to look at why we not treated this patient the way we treated it. What are the barriers, the biases that our healthcare people, and I have friends who say, oh, doctors don't think that when they go. I'm like, are you serious? What about even a woman? They're going to treat it differently.
Yeah.
It's not even get into the gender thing, because that's going to.
Well, and the DEI, there are some laws that are being passed in state legislatures that are banning, public or governmental agencies from having DEI programs. So, we're not gonna do diversity, equity, and improvement anymore. We're just gonna,
Well, the only pushback I have is after 20 years of being in diversity work, I don't know, again, if the same conversation is being had since you were in second grade, what is the point of having these things? I'm not saying I'm opposed to DEI training, but what I'm saying is if it all went away, what difference would be made in our society? Because what I've seen for the last 40 years is everything that is trying to push diversity and inclusion and acceptance is fought against vehemently. So what if all of those people, myself included, and of course this is hypothetical, what if we all said, not let's rally our forces and get back at all the oppressors, but how about let's just stop training, educating, let's stop expecting, let's stop teaching, let's just use all of our energy to find some island somewhere and go segregate ourselves, because they don't want us here anyway. They don't want our contributions, our books, our music, our voices, that, and by us, I mean anybody who's Black or brown. Because at this point, again, it's not just Black people, it's not just indigenous folks, it's anybody who didn't descend from Europe. And I found that I have 4% European, and I don't think that counts. but what if that were the reaction instead of the push toward equality and civil rights and gay rights? What if we just said America was literally created for the advancement of white European males, and anyone else and not just get in line, but there is no line. It was not created for anybody else. Women, people of color, Jewish people, even Catholics. Like, this was a white Protestant European destination. So why are we using our efforts to make it into something different when that's what it was always meant to be?
Well, we're not all cut out of a cookie cutter.
Good point.
Well, and if you listen to Marjorie Taylor Greene, she thinks we should all get divorced, so perhaps we would have offense and everything. So. But, and I hear your point that DE&I training, when it becomes a check the box and how many butts in the seats did we get through, did you do your mandatory thing, that's not gonna change hearts, right? We know there's people who are never gonna, you know, they can watch as many videos and have as many experiential conversations or lunch and learns or whatever. So yeah, so what will affect change? And I guess I think, going back to one of your earlier questions of how can we have these conversations, I think as Christians, we have a bit of an advantage. I mean, we have the umbrella and the cover of God who, you know, who really follow what we think was intended. Shouldn't even be a conversation, but here we are.
Right, but with, even in the Christian community, you know, I've been called, oh, you go to that liberal church.
Wait, don't they call it the liberal gay church now? I thought we had a new name.
You know, well, I haven't told that person that, you know,
All right, there you go, there you go.
some things, you know, you just don't go down that path with some people. But, you know, and then there are folks that the only true Christians are the ones that don't have sex before marriage, who don't kiss anyone other than their spouse, that, you know, there's no divorce. I mean, it's just, there's no, you're not gay, you're not, you know, it's just so black and white. And most people are like somewhere in the middle trying to figure it out. Like, you know, in the Christian community, if our community is so diverse and can't agree, it makes you wonder, we ever get there?
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
I mean, especially, yeah.
Amy, you can back me up on this. When we were on the search committee, a lot of the people that we interviewed for pastor talked about how many of the churches that they talked to said that they were open and affirming, but they weren't really open and affirming. And I'm sitting here thinking that when you asked about having conversations like this, we started on this road years ago when we declared we were open and affirming. And, you know, and this discussion specifically is part of that road. You know, in order to really become open and affirming, we have to confront these issues and you know, and really open ourselves up. You know, and that's hard. I understand why other congregations don't do it. You know, I've fully confessed to you guys, I'm struggling with this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for saying that.
And that's why it's easier for the cognitive dissonance to happen, or for there to be distance, or for people to abandon altogether, because it's, you know, I think about white flight during the 1950s and 60s. It was for a number of reasons: violence in communities, underpriced housing markets, fear of Black people coming in and taking over the community, and fear of the diminishment in value of communities, and fear of drugs, and fear of crime. And so, and for some people, fear of intermixing and races coming together and kind of blending. And so then we have migration, and wherever human migration patterns are, there are also behaviors and practices that go with. So just like when Black people migrated north, they brought with them certain customs from the South, and you had certain northern blacks that were indigenous to the North saying, you cannot do that here. You cannot do that here. That is not gonna go over well, you know?
Like spaghetti with fish?
Yeah, spaghetti with fish. In some cases, you'll still find a barbecue or a family reunion where that's the case. It's like,
What?
Spaghetti with fish? So fried fish with spaghetti with meat in it, and that, they say that's a Midwest thing, but it's.
two completely different things. But, you know, here we digress. But, you know, it's like, do you dry your soaked, rain soaked shirt, you know, on the porch or over, you know, the balcony ledge, or do you put it out back on the line? You know, like, those little nuances, or some of us wouldn't even think twice, we would just, you know, but for people coming from other countries, for example, I dated this woman who came from Nigeria, and she had 3 wonderful kids. But culturally, black people are not black people are not black people, and yet there are some things that are very similar. So in terms of food, I could sense, oh yeah, that's something that came over from Africa, because throughout the years, we still eat a variation of that dish. So that kind of thing was amazing to see that culturally there were some things that we had in common. But there were a lot of things where I had to say as an American, no, we don't do that. That we draw the line there, or, you know, just kind of setting the tone for expectation. And had I not taken certain classes and matriculated through certain systems, I would have been like some of my other family members and designated those behaviors as specifically white. Not American, oh, we don't do that as Americans. In some places they say, oh no, that's what white people do. And what I hear us doing and see us doing is saying, what do you do? What do you do? Here's what I do. Wow, here's something in common. Oh, I never knew that existed. And we're finding out more about each other, and we're hearing hard things, and we're saying, sometimes that doesn't feel good, and I wrestle with what this means or the implications for what this could mean for the future, and yet we're still here. How is it that we're still here when most people, whatever the color or generation is, would leave? I'm uncomfortable with having a black pastor, or a conversation about being trans, or a conversation about poor people because I have money from big oil and I don't want to give to those people, or I have, you know, whatever it is. So I'm gonna leave and go where it's safer to not be confronted with these things, because either I'm not prepared, I'm uncomfortable, or I feel threatened. So I guess my last question for us is, what do we take to the people who aren't here? Because it's great that we're here, that we can do this. And some of it's suffering through, and some of it's, yeah, I've heard some of this before, and some of it's not new, some of it we've heard before. And yet we know that there are people who should be in this conversation. Maybe not in this room tonight, but a part of this larger conversation, who will never be open to hearing this sort of thing. What is our responsibility to them?
Some will never be open, and others know that they should be open, and they're struggling in how to do that. I think it's not just that black and white.
Thank you.
It's so hard to change people's minds. We started watching Yellowstone, which is a fun show, but it's making me think what it's like out west, and what it's like to, well, I mean, what it's like to be kind of a cowboy. One of our nephews is getting married this summer. He's in Washington now, grew up in Minneapolis. And he went to school at Montana State. And I'm anxious to talk to him about that, to see if he's watched this this show. And because, I mean, it really, it's the first time I've ever watched anything even fictitious, where you get to see characters really develop, you know, from the mountain man kind of thing. And, you know, my parents were Democrats. And my mom, when Obama was running, when in the primary, she wasn't crazy about Hillary, but I think she was gonna vote for her. And she said something about not being comfortable if Obama were gonna have a lot of black people all of a sudden, you know, running everything. I said, I really don't think he will. I don't think he would have all black people in the cabinet, for instance. I don't think he would go to that extreme. And we just sat around one afternoon and talked. And she had gotten hip surgery at Henry Ford downtown. So the whole atmosphere of that Henry Ford hospital, the big one downtown, compared to in the suburbs. I mean, you know, and she saw for the first time, like, lots of bling and gold, you know, I mean, the different dress styles. And it took her a while to get used to that. And my dad was a little more obvious about it when we were waiting for dinner, lunch one day. And there were 2 or 3 black families that came into the restaurant, it was up at 12 Mile and Halsted, dressed up. The sun and New Year's and my dad made some kind of remark. I said, yeah, they're really making the place a lot more classy, aren't they, Dad? They're really, you know, making it, and he kind of looked at me and kind of realized that it was true. So, I mean, their liberal thoughts about society when put in close contact was different, but after my mom and I had this, and I wish I could remember more of what we said to each other about Obama. That she said, well, you know, I never thought about it that way. And she was in her 80s, you know, late 80s, farm girl from North Dakota, Norwegian. I mean, we were really more than Europeans. And I look at someone like that, you know, if she can change. And listen with an open mind. It was, but you know, gosh, I look around and I see how adamant people are in their beliefs, I think.
Remember, I was raised in Dearborn. Everybody remembers what that was like. Anybody with a discolored skin of any color came into town. The police were there, the fire department was there, they took away all their rights for fire protection, they had no police protection, they'd get out of town and use pure white. It was always that way for 20 years or more, 30 maybe it was, covered with a different mayor.
I think to answer your question, accept everyone, who they are, and love everyone, and I think Salem does a pretty good job at that.
I think accepting people where they are, you know, and knowing that we just saw Jesus Revolution last night at the movies. It's an interesting movie. I'll admit that. But one of the things it made me think of is, you know, if you're not speaking in a language that people will understand, they're not going to hear you. And it makes me think about when we asked you about, you went to Liberty University. How the heck did that happen? And your answer was so profound, like, well, if I'm going to really speak to this, I need to understand where they're coming from. And so, is it fear? Is it, you know, loss? Is it anxiety about your own identity? You know, what is it? And how do we listen to that in a space of love, right? And that, not that we're going to go along with it, but that we hear it and honor it, and, you know, try to figure it out.
Just like I was saying about, I understand better why some people are so concerned about teaching real history and everything. I think that's maybe the first step, is to understand why these people who aren't reacting the way we think they should, get a feeling for why they feel that way. Understanding their point of view a little bit, even if we don't agree with it.
I think too, we were talking about, you've had these conversations for how many years, and nothing's changed, and should we just give up?
Oh, yeah.
Or, and I don't know how we decide this, because that's way above my head, but like, change the conversation, come at it differently. You know what I mean?
Yes,
Then maybe
it's more-
people start.
yes.
Can you say more? 'Cause that-
I wish I could, I just think if that's not working, then
Yeah.
change it up.
Mhm.
Figure out what will people listen to, or, and it might be different for different groups, or somehow tie it all in.
I wholeheartedly agree. And Jam and I, which is, we talk about this amongst maybe 3 other things constantly all day long. And really it is changing it up. I was never the one even when I did diversity training for the boards of directors for UCC conferences, I was never the one to go in and say, you are all racist, you're all sexist, you're all homophobic, you're all transphobic. Now listen to me. Because you're right. No one, like every barrier has just gone up. No one's paying attention. But if we could bring in personal stories, bring in examples of good and bad examples of when this has worked and when it hasn't worked. And, you know, like Connie talking about your grandmother, that's a story, for example, if we were in a board of directors, that's something that I would then be able to connect with. My grandmother was so homophobic. And if she could change, then there's hope for anybody. And I feel that same way about, you know, most people that are staunch anti-anyone. You just hold space long enough. You don't condemn them. You don't call them deplorables and wish them to hell and tell them they're all gonna whatever. Because then we're not opening up the space for safe, transformative, spirit-filled interactions to take place. And we can't change people, but the Holy Spirit can. And if we don't have a message or a vessel through which the Holy Spirit can be transformative, then we aren't doing our job as the church. So I think Salem, yes, we in this room and on Sunday and every day of the week when we're at events or doing any act of service, we are doing the work and we're being the work. And I'm just grateful that we can have these conversations and not run out of here and go in our separate corners of the world and pledge never to see each other again, because a lot of places can't do what we just did.
Yeah.
And Bonnie, you know, Bonnie,
Yeah.
when she was interning with Debbie, it's like it was like, kind of like Leona Reedwing, you know, this sweet little lady who was like, anyway, Judy Denby's sister was something else. And so here's Bonnie, a middle-aged white woman, you know, who was just this sweet woman who happened to be a lesbian. And then she got married, and her wife was a member here, very active for a while. But I think probably that coincidental timing of Bonnie coming in to intern with Debbie when we were going through the Owen.
That was the spirit.
Yeah, it was just terrific, because she was just like your next door neighbor, your sister, your aunt.
Well, Bonnie would make calls to my mom when she was in the group home that we used to have. And one of the aides, she would see her come in. She left one day and she says, is she married and have children? And this woman was Romanian. And I said, yeah, she's married to Loretta, but she has 2 grown children from a prior marriage. You allow gay people in your church and you let them be pastors? We love everybody, you know, and she was just appalled. And she said, I said, don't you love everybody? Well, yes, but they're not allowed to worship at our church. She says, we just tell them to go to other churches, that's why they're out there. So,
Here's our card, please join us on Sunday.
Wow.
so that,
Well, what I'm talking about,
Wow.
was gonna say something about it. You hear all this stuff about kindness, love, caring on the TV, and are people just giving lip service to it, or do they really put it into practice?
Right, Ms. Jennifer, testify.
Amen.
Amen. I think one of the things that works here is being graceful. We're full of grace here. We saw examples. You spoke about your grandmother. That gave me strength because I have been doing this work all of my life and I'm getting tired. And there's a lot of people, especially those who are Black and brown, who are doing this work and they're getting what has been called spiritual fatigue. We're just tired of pushing against a wall for no reason. Because if our allies are the ones that cut the legs and feet from underneath us because they become uncomfortable or they leave or they're just lip service, like Ms. Jennifer said, then why are we doing this? Why am I wasting energy while I'm watching people that look and act like me dying by droves? And so to hear that an 80-some-year-old white woman can have a moment and say, you know what? All my life I have been thinking about something differently, but I can change. That gives me a hope to do it while I'm tired, to do it while I'm in pain, to do it while I don't see any hope, to do it while I'm sitting in the face of those who spit at me or call me out of my name, whatever color they are. And I can hold the grace for them in hopes that maybe something that has been said, one person plants, one person waters, and God gives the increase. But I just want to offer the same as the level of fear that comes from having hard conversations. It's a weariness that happens when if you to walk down the street and have to be hyper vigilant about how you present just so that you would not be considered someone who is possibly dangerous. I have a large frame. I have a large voice. So anytime I was in the room, I was a manager in restaurants. And so I would walk up and be like, how can I help you? And I was so not, yes, honey, yes, dear, how you doing? And anytime I would get stern, now I'm yelling. And now it's not just the fact that there's a masculine presenting person yelling. There's a big Black person saying something loud, and everybody in the building that thinks that that's something dangerous now stops, not only focuses, but places their own opinions and actions into that scenario. So that's why some people are tired. But to go back to that, just the hope that comes, and that needs to happen. I would never have that experience if we did not have the grace to sit in this room and you have the strength and wisdom and courage to speak that out. Larry, for you to say, this is hard for me. For you to say, I've been hearing this since I was in second grade. When is this gonna happen? But for Ms. Alice to talk about, I lived 20 years in a city that ran Black people out of town, right? And yet you are sitting in a church with a Black queer pastor and a partner, and you know what I mean? Like that's the testimony that when I say we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of testimony, that's what that means. It doesn't mean that it has to be right. It doesn't mean that it has to be all put in the box. If I can say I'm tired, y'all, I'm just tired. I'm tired of having to be nice around all of my intersections. I have to be nice to queer people about me being a Christian. I have to be nice to Black people about me not being in Black spaces. I have to be nice to white people about me being Black in white spaces. It gets weary. And if I hear those of us, and this is why I love Salem, that would say, honey, I don't understand what's going on. I don't know what that is, but I know that I love you. And so we can have a conversation about what that is. I can talk about the things that make me uncomfortable and I can figure it out. But I don't know if that can happen on a large enough scale to make a difference, but I'm hopeful that it does.
And like the starfish story, we can make a difference.
One at a time, come on.
I can say, I love hearing you talk about your personal experience like that. I love hearing that. That's helping me a lot. And this conversation, last week I kept saying, I'm having a hard time understanding what her concept of the beloved community. I'm understanding it more and more and more as we talk.
That's the word.
I just looked up on my phone because I made a note yesterday. I was busy doing something and I usually have NPR just kind of in the background. And there was a discussion on what they call religious deconstruction.
Yes,
You heard of that?
yes.
Yeah, and I want, and if there were people who left the church as non-atheists because it's just not working for me, others are, it was just, I go, oh gosh, this was so interesting to me, and I want to listen to that, but, yeah, those of you who listen to NPR, religious deconstruction,
And I know we're at time, but, Lauren, I put on Facebook, Lawrence joined our private Trinity Health Path College resource group today at work. He was on our panel, and it was fabulous. He was so good. I had friends texting me, I wish I lived near you, I come to your church. But there was comments that kind of kept going in our teams chat throughout the day, and even during the session, I don't know if you saw them, but it broke my heart. So it's our LGBTQ group at my employer, which is a Catholic healthcare organization. And so many people were saying, yeah, I left the church a long time ago because and I felt so bad. I wanted to reach out and tell each one of them, keep looking if it's important to you. I mean, obviously there's some people who are just like, it's not for me, I don't want or anything, but it just was so hard to say, no, not doing it, that's too painful, don't trust them, blah, 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 and other kind of things. So
one of these people, there were 3 people on this panel, and one was a pastor. She's gonna continue doing what she feels she needs to do, but it's hard.
well, can we say we took up the cost and joy of discipleship, right? That's
I'm
the
very
cost.
anxious to get to the last 4 chapters.
Well, on that note, I am grateful for this conversation. Let us go now, next week, chapter 4, and whatever else comes up. But thank you for having this hard conversation and getting through Lent, because there will be Easter, there will be resurrection at the end. I promise you, and the publishers do too. All right.
Thank you. Thank you for dinner.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
you're welcome.
Very delicious.